Today is the 158th Security Thought Leadership webinar. And today's a little bit different, as that early discussion may have implied, for two reasons. One, today we're discussing the findings of a particular report. And secondly, all our panelists are from Australia, which is just the way it went, actually. It wasn't a design thing, it's just the way it went. And the idea of thought leadership is to critique today in order that we get a better type of security tomorrow. And the topic today is one that has attracted a lot of interest. Now, artificial intelligence, a security essential or a dangerous big brother. And you could be forgiven for believing that AI is the answer to all our problems. When you go around conferences, you're saying we're building in AI, AI will do this, with the addition of AI, we will be able to do all sorts of dynamic things. And yet a recent report by the ASIS Foundation found it to be problematic. Unsophisticated was one quote. Dangerous big brother was one of the other intimations. And definitely isn't presented as the answer to all our problems. So we've got two of the authors, plus another industry expert, to discuss these issues. And in a second, I will introduce all three. Once they've been introduced, I will ask each of them from an opening statement, and then we'll go to questions. If you use the question and answer button at the bottom of your screen, we'll endeavour to involve you as soon as we can. So at this rather earlier time, then, let's meet our panelists. And first of all, Michael. Michael, please introduce yourself.
Hi everyone, my name is Michael Cool. I'm an academic at Edith Cowan University in Western Australia, and my specific areas of focus is security science. So I lecture in that area. I supervise high degree by research and execute a number of research grants across the broad domain of security science sort of subject matter. Thanks,
and you're one of the authors of this report,
yes.
Michael. Let's go and meet Debbie, also in Australia. Debbie.
Hi everyone, thanks for having me here. My name's Deborah Evans. I am a security researcher. I've got a background in security, a Bachelor of Science in Security. I've just finished a Master of Science by research, and I plan on going straight into PhD if possible in the area of artificial intelligence.
Wow, that's it. That's a good area to be going into, I think. We'll find out more as we go through. We'll find out more as we go through. And finally, a good friend of ours, Chris, who's all the way from us, who's, by the way, in the preamble to this, was complaining it's got to stay up very late over there. Thanks ever so much for joining, Chris. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Martin, and well done on 158. That's quite an achievement. Chris Cubbage from My Security Media. And as it happens, Debbie in the background has a copy of our magazine. So we have about 14 different channels across different technology. So yeah, we cover everything from space to cybersecurity, drones and robotics, and obviously AI and machine learning and that type of technology. So
Chris,
good topic, Martin.
Thank you very much indeed. Really appreciate it. Right, what we're going to do now then is we're going to go to each of our panelists and we're going to invite them to make an opening statement, 3 minutes, when they get to say whatever they want to about the subject matter. Can I ask you please that if you have got a question, if you can use the question and answer button at the bottom of your screen, I will endeavour to incorporate those questions in the ensuing discussion. So without further ado then, let's go to Michael and ask Michael for his opening statement. Michael.
Thanks, Martin. Probably some of the broader issues, everyone talks about the benefits and concerns of artificial intelligence. And I think most importantly, we need to dissect what we sort of mean. So we have narrow and broad artificial intelligence, and then we have what we call general artificial intelligence. And really general artificial intelligence is where we're starting to get to the same level of sort of human cognition. And they're very different. So with your narrow and your broad artificial intelligence, we have machines that appear to be smart, but what we're really talking about is computational intelligence. They're not actually artificial intelligence. That's something that this project sort of articulated very significantly. And so when we go into some of the concerns, I suppose, from the concern side of the house is what we raised is artificial intelligence is focused on achieving objectives, and it achieves objectives through various rules. Some of those rules are human written rules. Some of those rules are machine generated rules. So ultimately, artificial intelligence is very focused on achieving a defined objective within a defined environment. So if you think about a chess game, for example, we've all seen the various smart chess systems. The problem with a chess game is it's a very defined environment. When we go to looking at the objectives in terms of security, security is a very broad concept. It sits on a continuum, and it's got a multiplex of different abstract elements going on. So it's a very dynamic environment. So we look at achieving security objectives, and some of the complexities is security may not be the only objective. So security is a value that sits on a strata of a complex range of other values. So what we have to make sure with the AI is that we don't pursue security at the cost of other values, whether it be human life or environmental concerns, etc. So when we look at sort of AI, its purpose is to achieve an objective. It achieves it through a set of rules. The tighter the environment, the more accurate the AI is. As we move into a security environment, it gets a lot more broader, a lot more variables at play, a lot more abstract. And therefore, it'll be challenging to see, for example, some of the concerns. And I often think about, we did a PESTEL analysis, so political, economic, social, technological, environmental, and legal framework concern. And what we actually found is that many of the concerns raised by Ulrich Beck in his Risk Society thesis 30-odd years ago sort of started to come to the fore, where when we start to look at the technological developments of man, we're sort of at this point in time that Beck noted, where the risks are starting to elude our ability to control them in terms of understanding fully the risks. And I think one of the problems with general AI is trying to truly understand the risks. And when we talk about it in terms of security, we think about it in terms of the two broad domains of security. So we have the traditional sort of security, which is in the military sense, and that's where we're going to see developments in weaponized type artificial intelligence. And then we have the non-traditional domain where we start to look at security within the sort of civil society paradigm. And within that paradigm, we sort of looked at technologies in terms of technology to observe, technology to detect, control and respond, and in combinations of those. And in fact, some of the issues that we found, for example, was with respond technology. So when we start to go into sort of some of the response technologies and you look at, for example, robotics, we start to hit some of the issues associated with, for example, Asimov's laws. When we start to consider security in the traditional sense, and we start to look at, for example, security in a nuclear age, we've got the zeroth law. So there's a number of issues that start to come into play. And one of the concerns that we have to manage is we have to manage the security objectives in terms of how they clash with other values or other objectives. So that was something that started to sort of resonate. So how manageable are these? And generally when we start to think of big things, we start to think of regulating at a national and an international level. So if we go back to the 60s, for example, in non-proliferation treaties that we looked at in terms of the nuclear development age, you know, the concerns were that nuclear energy or nuclear weapons were potentially becoming very widespread. Well, when we start to look at AI is widespread, but more importantly, it's going to become more widespread. But unlike previous areas, we're not going to be able to control the AI. So we can't control the components of AI. We can't stop people researching in AI. So at some point when we get AI on the market, we need to start to look at how we're going to regulate this in terms of international laws, international norms in terms of rules-based order. So for me, what really come out of this is that what we don't want to do is we don't want to look at an environment where the information technological environment, essentially the technology gave us capabilities before the laws were able to protect people. So if we look at, for example, cyberbullying, digital fraud, revenge porn, the laws weren't in place to protect the victims before we had the technical capability. So one of the concerns looking forward, especially as we're trying to develop, for example, general AI, is that the laws have to be in place in front of the technology. So we need a lot of clever people getting together. We need the anthropologists, we need the sociologists, we need the legal scholars, we need the computer scientists and policymakers getting together and having these robust discussions now. And if we accept the notion that the technology is going to come, so we don't really need to focus on the technology. What we need to start focusing on, especially in academia, is doing the robust social science research so that we can start to think about, you know, the type of regulations that are going to be needed, the type of international norms that are going to be required, you know, the type of laws, etc. So if we currently look, for example, in the civil society paradigm, You know, we use technology to observe, to detect, to control, and to respond. What the future looks like in this area is more about a fusion of technology. So we're going to see increases, I guess, in efficiency. We're going to be able to see increases in larger scale capabilities. We're going to have less sort of errors. But we're also going to try and see the specific areas as they develop. So, for example, when we look at response technologies in our project, we found response technologies poorly developed. And when we start to look at how we regulate response technologies, we can think of examples in international law, such as the Caroline test in international law, where we look at the notion of immediacy, necessity, and proportionality. So how do we start to regulate some of the response technologies around that sort of international norms framework? So some of the bigger issues that already sit in, I guess, in the academic debate around a number of other areas, whether it be robotics, etc., or international law, we're going to have to draw those into the discussion on artificial intelligence.
Michael, can I just wind you up quick very soon here, because I want to bring in Debbie and Chris, and then we'll come back to you.
Yep, and I guess one of the things is the effective safeguards for me really needs to sit within the structure of that AI, which we can talk about later.
Yeah, sounds good. Thank you, Michael. Debbie, come to you. Your thoughts on this topic as well, please.
Yeah, well, Michael's raised some really, really good points there. But just in regard to sort of that topic, is AI a security essential, or is it a dangerous big brother? I think it's actually both, to be perfectly honest. So I think, you know, I'll touch on a few points, and I'll try and keep it sort of fairly brief. I'll touch on why AI is essential for security as a discipline. Also, what are those type of big brother risks? And more importantly, what are the more significant overarching risks that we sort of find? As well as what are, you know, we really have that need for responsible AI, but there's challenges in achieving that. So that really touches on you know, and sort of expands on what Michael was saying in terms of the regulation. So that's really important. But in terms of why AI is important and really essential in security, I think we really need to be aligned with development in other sectors and disciplines. And if we're not aligned to that and we don't keep up with that development, we're going to find that we're really significantly disadvantaged. So particularly you look at cyber, and that's developing exponentially. If, you know, and even some of our security technologies, such as network surveillance systems and those types of things, they're pulling in huge amounts of data. So if we don't utilize AI in those technologies, we're not going to be able to maximize the benefits out of that. So there's that sort of element of it. And also, you know, in terms of our keeping up with our threat actors and adversaries, we need to make sure that we're on top of it, because if we're not, they're going to be, and we're going to miss out that way as well. So that's really where it's essential. And it's absolutely essential, but there are also dangers associated with AI in security technologies. So in terms of those big brother type dangers, and the biggest one that sort of we find is discussed in the literature and in a lot of discourse is those privacy, ethical and human rights considerations. That's a really big one. But I think just in terms of privacy and in relation to where we're at in contemporary society, privacy is really an illusion these days. So we're so heavily invested sort of as consumers and subscribers to so many different technologies. We've got so much of our own personal and social and professional lives already out there that's really there for the taking by tech giants and all sorts of different corporations and governments. So really privacy is a bit of an illusion as far as I'm concerned, but people still have rights. So when we're talking about using AI and security technologies, we really need to ask questions like, you know, what's the intended use of the data? What controls are in place to govern that use of data? And how transparent is the system in its entirety? Because we really do need that transparency. So there's sort of the, you know, the privacy type risks, but there's also bigger, more significant overarching risks. And that's a lot of the stuff that Michael was touching on as well. So when we're talking about, you know, as machines become more intelligent and take on more of the roles of what humans are doing, we really will start to see reduced human decision-making and control. And that's really problematic because there can be really quite significant consequences from that. So in terms of those risks, we need to start taking responsibility for how AI is developed. So we welcome responsible AI initiatives. But we can also see there's really sort of challenges in achieving that responsible AI. So in these early stages, we really need to be looking at getting some sort of global consensus among nations and governments and people and cultures and communities as to what does responsible AI look like. We can sort of throw out a few terms here and there and you know, talk about fairness and empathy and a few other of these elements, but we really need to look at it cross-culturally and really establish those boundaries, those social, moral and ethical parameters. And then we can start looking at governance, like what is governance? How do we govern AI? How do we regulate it? And have we or certain countries or nations already sort of surpassed those social, moral and ethical parameters? And if they have, how do we rein them in? So what does governance look like? So there's all of those sorts of issues. So absolutely, I think on one hand, AI is absolutely essential in security so that we're not disadvantaged, but we really need to initiate some sort of global governance of responsible AI.
Thank you very much, Debbie. Excellent points and plenty for us to come back to on that. Just to say, if you'd like to get a question in, please use the question and answer button at the bottom of your screen. I'll come back to you. We've got a couple in advance as well. So please do get your questions in. And as soon as we've heard from Chris, we'll come to you. Chris, fascinated to hear what you say.
I start my taglines. I'm an optimistic pessimist. So I think we are asking the right questions of AI. I don't think we're going to get to a governance platform that's globally accepted. You know, we're going at different paces in different parts of the industry. In terms of those findings of this particular report, I think some are on the note and then some probably aren't. So we're seeing AI, particularly in, say, cybersecurity, network security. Microsoft is ticking off 12 trillion alerts a day. 12 trillion alerts a year, I beg your pardon, but 12 trillion, either way, it's in the trillions. So they can't do that without machine learning. I think the other one I was going to raise is the terminology and the language we use of AI versus machine learning. Machine learning is quite advanced, particularly in its specific applications. But I thought from what we do in the media, on the media side, we have a very sort of pancake view across different sectors. And one to look out for is, say, Tesla and what they're doing with their autonomous vehicles and the driverless car. Tesla is basically a robotics company making a robot that will drive you wherever you want to go. Their AI Tech Day is streamed live on YouTube, and it's well worth having a look at in terms of what they are doing in visual analytics and image by image of what that vehicle sees. And how it interprets that is, it's an amazing piece of technology that they're developing. And then they will be able to apply that across different sort of platforms once they develop that. The other one is Nightscope, just listed on NASDAQ. It's been in development for a while. It's an autonomous robotics system. And again, that is out there learning. And I suppose the other one with Tesla and the likes of Nightscope, as their sort of platforms are out there gathering new data, it all comes back to central servers that, again, is training and learning in this. So there is a sort of ongoing learning that they will do. But on the flip side of that, we're actually reaching end of Moore's Law. And we just released it today, an interview with Oak Ridge National Laboratory. They've just finished their Frontier, the first exascale supercomputer in the USA. So they are now coming to, it's almost like 100,000 PlayStations processing together. This is how powerful it is, but it's a massive computer. They're building them one by one. The CTO that we spoke to, quantum is still about 20 years away that it has a functional capability. So these are the fastest, most powerful computers, and they grapple with power and energy. They grapple with the software. So when we talk about AI, it's very clever in its known capability. I think when we talk to the point of singularity, I think we're a long way away. A lot of people are calling that, that we would be there by now, maybe by 2040. The more I learn, the more I see, I think we're a long way away from that, at least 30 to 40 years. And then even then it's going to be a fluke if it even happens. But, I think we're reaching the end of Moore's Law. And the interview today, it's our episode 315, very much relates to this particular topic in the next generation. We're there with our processing capability in terms of AI and machine learning. The next 2 generations will be advancing our software and making our software smarter so it runs with that processing, because we're still coding and building software as we did 20 years ago. And then the next one is taking our algorithms, the machine learning algorithms, to the next generation as well and making them better. So we still have a long way to go. We're getting there. I think the governance side of things, though, we're already at a black box point of view with a lot of the AI, and we've just done a couple of interviews on electronic surveillance. They're reviewing the electronic surveillance frameworks at a national level here in Australia. So I spoke to a couple of experts in that. From a law enforcement viewpoint, they are asking questions of how do they intercept sort of quantum and artificial intelligence platforms for their own intelligence, and under a warrant, how do they intercept that data, or how does it work? And everyone's like, you can't, you're not going to be able to. We're a long way away from that. And, you know, when we talk about privacy, ethics and responsible AI, no one's doing that. Like, the vendors in cybersecurity are throwing the terminology around as a sales pitch, and it's not responsible use of AI, and they don't even understand what they're talking about. So I just think some are doing really well. I raised those particular ones, Microsoft's and Tesla's, and so the Nightscopes. They're very specific on what they're building, whereas the general AI and the terminology, how it's thrown around, and the actual point of singularity that we might go to in terms of, you know, the future of humanity is going to be what do they call some sort of artificial being that has a conscience or a self-awareness. That's ultimately where we're heading. We will ultimately get there, I think, but I think we're a long way away just from the processing and the computing capability isn't there yet.
Fascinating. Thank you very much indeed. I have to say, as a non-technical person, all this is quite shocking to me. Don't forget, if you've got some questions, please use the question and answer button at the bottom of your screen. And Michael, I'll start with you. And if I could, it's a question from Dr. Glenn Kitteringham, who perhaps is asking something that is at the forefront of many of our minds, listening to the three of you speak. And it says, given that governments all over the world are drifting to totalitarianism on both the left and right, or at least some are, and given how big tech is proven over and over again that they are aligned with governments, in some cases at least, what can be said to convince us that AI won't be used against the citizenry? I mean, this is surely a potential danger, isn't it? If I can ask Michael first, and I'll come to Debbie and Chris straight afterwards. Michael first.
I think the short answer is absolutely it can be, and that's part of some of the issues going forward. So, for example, you know, Chris said it's hard to regulate this stuff, and certainly at this point in time, there's no regulation. As Chris says, they throw around the terms like responsible AI. What are they even talking about? You know, when we look at my example, for example, I'd draw on analogies with, say, the IMO and ICAO. So they're UN specialised agencies that regulate, for example, aviation safety, maritime safety and security. And so if we are going to be able to achieve any form of global norms in the AI space, then I think it needs to come down through one of those organs in the UN and get it at a macro level. Until you regulate, you're not going to control big business. In fact, in many ways, you know, people have actually often accused big business of controlling politicians and policymakers. So essentially, the difference is if we go back to the 60s and we look at the non-proliferation treaties that I sort of mentioned in my opening statement, the US drove the sort of treaties because they were concerned that the nuclear technology was starting to become more and more widespread. Now, the thing is with nuclear technologies is you can control components of it. How do you control AI? You can't control the components of AI. And the more research that's being done, and the research is being done in every country in the world, where we're going to get more and more capabilities, we will get to a point where unless you have some macro scale norms at an international level, and remember that when we talk about international law, there is no international law. What you actually have is international norms based on a splattering of agreements. And so I think for me, the only way that you can stop AI being used against the citizenry is under a framework of some international norms. Remember that, for example, in international law, each state is its own sovereign state. Each state is in charge of all the affairs that occur within its sort of geographical boundaries, and other states can't interfere with the day-to-day operations of the state. However, states can't
Michael,
persecute.
very quickly,
Sorry.
Michael, where does that leave us then? So very, very quickly, in a sentence or two. So the problem is, on the one hand, you're saying it can be used against the citizens. We need international law, and it won't happen.
Well, what I'm saying
Very
is,
quickly.
under international law, theoretically, you can't persecute your own citizens, and therefore you can, the UN and other organisations can sort of theoretically act. So we look at, for example, the second invasion of Iraq. So I guess with AI, what I'm saying is that unless you get that macro buy-in, you're not going to regulate AI.
Okay. Thank you very much indeed. Debbie, I mean, this is sounding to the non-techie very, very dramatically bad. Is it?
Well, look, I think in terms of that governance and the government use and that misuse and abuse of technology and AI, that's really, really a significant issue, and it's a huge concern. But it's not just governments that are likely to abuse that. It's people. It's part of human nature, and it doesn't matter whether we're talking about governments or organisations or any scale. It's human nature, and this is one of the things that we're going to be confronted with in terms of AI. Is really our own ugliness as human beings. And we're seeing that, just to sort of veer off topic a little bit, we're seeing that when we're talking about, bias in machine learning and those types of issues. If there's undertones of racism, we see racism. If there's bias, we see the bias, because AI is only going to be reflected back at us. So it's really that, in terms of our shortcomings as human beings, that's going to happen across the board, whether it's organisations, whether it's governments, and what we really need to do is to be able to push these issues out into the forefront, out for discussion, so that we can address it collectively. And it's not necessarily going to come from regulation, because there's always going to be that pushback, there's always going to be corruption, there's always going to be issues with governance, and we see that biological weapons convention, all of those types of structures, there's always going to be issues, but we need as a collective to be able to push it out to the forefront so that we can discuss it and address it as best we can.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Chris, come to you on this. I mean,
I think when you say big brother, I think we're moving away from AI to more data science and the capability of where the data points are. And I mentioned the electronic surveillance review. The thinking from a law enforcement, and I'm ex-federal law enforcement, and I've done a lot of interception. So you would generally go on a phone number or a person. The thinking now from law enforcement is they want to know everyone who had access to an application. And so they take a warrant on the application, and there could be millions of users on that. And then once they've got that data in a warrant, it goes into a data lake, and they never throw it away. And eventually their data lakes get bigger and bigger. So that's happening in Western nations. And if you have a look at this, same thing's happening in China. They've got 1.3 billion people. They don't have privacy controls, state control. They have sort of Uyghur populations that they are particularly manipulating. They are throwing those Uyghurs out into the broader population to see if they can pick them up through facial recognition. There's a whole, this is data science. This is not sort of artificial intelligence and the like. It is machine learning. How do we collect those data points and then create the patterns or identify the patterns that can tell us that a crime is occurring or may occur and the like. But I think that's the difference. But yeah, absolutely. Western law enforcement is looking at this now. They want the capability. They've had the capability. I mean, look at, there's been a massive FBI, Australian Federal Police investigation into organised crime after they had access to the application, everyone who used that application, and then all the prosecutions came out of that. So at that level, it can be extremely powerful, has been shown to be very powerful. But then, you might flip it over to say facial recognition, and there's pushback on facial recognition. There's a moratorium and that in Europe. California has put a ban on it. A lot of discussion here in Australia, but again, Australia is very advanced in what they do. I don't think there's not a lot of public discussion on this here in Australia. Victorian police are working on passports and driver's licenses running that through social media photos to detect people on that. So there's a lot of research going on here. And once it's uncovered and they go, wow, that's a new capability, they're not going to turn it off. They're not going, oh, that was really, that could really work for police. But no, we don't want, I mean, QR codes, for example, we've seen them during the pandemic. No, the police will never access this data. Don't worry about it. The moment that data was available, there was cases in Victoria, WA, and I know I'm ex-police, you know, the moment you can access something, if you're illegally able to get it, you'll get it. It's a shotgun approach, right? So that's the danger here when we talk about the governance and the privacy. But unfortunately, the horse is already bolted. By the time you're having a privacy discussion, and Deborah, you're bang on the mark in terms of privacy is a myth, even in the modern age. One thing we haven't touched on, and I was in my thoughts before, was the behavioral analytics, where cybersecurity is going to, on your device, on your phone, every device that you have access to. That is now the level. That's the zero trust. If you hear zero trust approach now in cybersecurity, that is taking it down to the behavioral analytics of the user, even down to how the phone is used, held, where it is, the application being accessed, and where from, and at what time, really down to a very granular level. Now then apply that to a state level who then has access to that information, and where you are in the street and what camera you happen to pass by at any one time. They can identify you very, very easily. So this is data science we're talking about when we talk about Big Brother, and it is extremely powerful, and the capability is there right now.
Thank you very much. Let me just say a couple of things. If you, Chris, could you, I'm getting some notes here. Could you put in the chat the link to the interview you were talking about? People would like to follow up with that.
Will do.
And the second thing is the ASIS Foundation report, which Debbie and Michael were talking about, is available from the ASIS International website. The idea today, though, is you get some of the headline findings right at you. So let's go quickly, a couple more questions. And I've got a question here that was sent to me, which was that in your report, Michael, you mentioned the use of AI being unsophisticated. And the question is this a particular characteristic of the security world? It goes back to Debbie's point. I'll come to you on this in a minute, Debbie, about whether others are moving faster, and so it's unsophisticated security comparatively, or whether it's just unsophisticated generally, of which security is a part. Michael, very briefly, wouldn't mind, because I want to get a couple more questions in, and then I'll come to Debbie.
So we only looked at security technologies. We didn't, and we also looked at cyber. So cyber, as Chris points out, is quite advanced in its uptake of AI. What we found is it very much differs. So when you look at observed technologies, we're starting to get a lot more AI or sort of deep learning algorithms, etc., being undertaken. So observed technologies were sort of very skewed, obviously, in terms of the ability to take data in, facial recognition, number plate recognition, and the like. So we saw sort of areas elevated in observed technologies. Control and response were very, very low. They were very minimal. We're starting to see a little bit more in detection, but not much changes there. So we sort of looked at comparisons across those observe, detect, control and respond technologies. And what we actually found in physical security technologies, that the level of sophistication of AI in terms of intelligent autonomy was very, very low. When we looked at cyber, for example, intelligent autonomy was starting to elevate quite high, about level 6, 7. So
thank you. Good answer. Good. So it does vary across different technologies. Back to your point, Debbie. I wonder whether I could pick you up on about your point about, so you were arguing the case for AI. You were making the point the security world's got to keep up.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah, I get that point. I suppose it raises the possibility, if it's unsophisticated, then is security world, in your opinion, behind the rest of the world, where the world is, or?
Probably only marginally. So
marginally behind or marginally ahead?
Marginally behind security would be. Cyber tends to sit sort of leaps and bounds ahead of all the other sectors from what we found. But I mean, AI is reasonably unsophisticated across the board, and that's primarily because it can't interpret context in the same way that humans can. There's that lack of contextual insight and understanding. So until we're at the point that AI can really contextualize situations. It's only really representing what we give it and what we feed to it. Hence, that's why I was sort of saying about the bias. And, you know, if we give it racism or tones of racism, that's going to be really strongly reflected back at us. So it's really that sort of, you know, I think it's just marginally behind, but it is pretty much unsophisticated. And I think it's going to take a considerable amount of time before we get to the point that there is the sophistication and that context and the interpretation, that really broader understanding.
Chris, you're nodding in agreement there. So really important point. Your thoughts?
Well, I was going to say, I don't think we're ever going to get there because our data sets are corrupted already. That bias is already there. And then starting afresh, we don't have the data set. So I think that's where we're stuck, is the data sets that we've got in our institutions is already biased. And we're seeing that facial recognition's one as well, because they're loading up all the known criminals into that. And guess what? They're all minority groups and the like, and they're the ones being detected as most likely at risk. So
that's the reason, though, Chris. That's the reason some are saying that as part of the response, we need to have diverse teams involved in the process. I mean,
you've still got to create the data. I mean, a machine can't learn unless you're giving it a specific task, and then it needs data sets to learn from. So if the data set, and that's the pure aspect, and then now even who's creating the data set, and then making sure that hasn't got bias in it as well. This is much easier said than done. And then, that's just raised another point. How do you, that was in this episode 315. So this supercomputer that they're working on, they're trying to detect, okay, an earthquake. What will be the impact of an earthquake in a particular location, particular, strength and whatever. And then, okay, what if that earthquake moves 10 kilometers, 15 kilometers, and then do those calculations again, right? How do they even know that is an accurate calculation? How do they know it's even correct? So there's a lot of, because this is, again, in layman's term, 100,000 PlayStations doing a process together. A human can't work it out. No one knows how a computer beats a human at chess. It just does it. We don't understand how it happened, but we know it happened. And so the accuracy of the finding, once we get into this supercomputer and an AI that's making decisions and it's autonomous, this is guesswork at our end. We don't know if there's bias in there. We should assume there will always be human bias in there.
Michael.
There has to be bias because you're talking about decisions made on statistics. So as you
that's different. Well, it's a little bit like maybe say a driverless car, and a family walks out in front of the driverless car, and does the car stop, swerve, and hit somebody else, or how is that made? Is that a data set, or is that an ethics question? I think that's
Michael,
kind of where we're moving to.
Okay, Michael, give us your thought, because you're talking about biases inbuilt and carry on.
Well, that's right. When you look at the larger the data set you get, as Chris has already said, your biases are all inbuilt. You can't actually avoid that, because essentially all AI at the moment, when we look at, for example, narrow and broad AI, we're looking at decisions based on statistics. And as our database gets larger and larger and larger, our statistical inferences become more complex. But ultimately, we're talking about correlations. We're talking about comparisons between, when you look at a car moving left or right, you're looking at calculations of distance, but you're looking at averages. You're looking at every decision that's been made by an AI is a computational outcome based on a statistical analysis. Now, there's different algorithms that give you different abilities to interlink different statistical inputs and processes. But ultimately, what comes out of an AI is an analysis of some statistical process. It's mathematics. It's not seeing a bird. Okay, it's not seeing the scenes that we perceive to see in, for example, video surveillance. It's not seeing that scene. What it's seeing is that average of of pixels in a statistical algorithm.
Yeah. Our guys, again, I just happened Jane did this interview with in Tennessee here, this is exactly what he's talking about, is training the AI to be better at interpreting that data and getting faster at it. Because if you look at the Tesla, they are making decisions on frame by frame. It's not video. It's picture by picture, and it's so fast. It's interpreting all the other pictures, which I found surprising. I thought it was video analytics, so you could tell the story, but no, frame by frame in real time, it's analyzing that frame by frame, which must slow it down, right? It can't be so fast. So yeah, look, that's slightly beyond my expertise on, exactly the computational and the algorithm.
It's worrying enough, Chris. It's worrying enough. Well, let me just come to you because we've only got 3 minutes left, and I want to give each a question. Debbie, this is all sounding dramatically bad, I've got to tell you, from an outsider's point of view. Let me ask this question to all of you, very briefly, if you wouldn't mind. But Debbie first, should we be worried about this? It sounds as though the machines are getting a lot of knowledge. They could be, well, they are going to be biased, you're saying. It could be used against us. You can't implement an international law. Oh, my word. If you want to write a bad security scenario, here's your script. Debbie first.
Definitely. I think, look, for me, the biggest thing that we really need to consider at the minute, apart from that sort of responsible use and responsible AI, is we need to keep in mind at what point can we cut off AI and say, this is really bad, the bias is bad, machine learning's bad, we're not getting out of it what we wanted, these are the consequences, let's undo it. Because I think that we're going to be nearing a point where we can't simply undo it. When you look at sort of that techno trajectory that we're on, and in terms of the internet and emails and those types of things, we can't just switch it off without having massive implications on our economy, our businesses, the way that we operate. And we really need to keep in mind, as we develop AI and we've got all the supporting structures and infrastructure around us, we are going to get to that point that we can't just simply undo it. So we need really significantly to keep in mind what's important and what don't we want development. Where do we want to stop it?
Thank you very much indeed. Chris, just 20 seconds if you wouldn't mind. I want to ask you this question. You and Michael, 20 seconds each because we're running out of time. Is it possible to build in a fail-safe?
No, and I think just following on from Deborah, we're creating that vulnerability in our own systems. We become reliant on it. Therefore, we're vulnerable to a single point of failure when we're so, and particularly on the integration and the interdependence of these systems as well. I raised this last night as it happens. We have the potential of World War III, the 2 years into a coronavirus, and here we are all online. We've adapted, and now everyone's in hybrid environments. We'll now take the IT environment out. Let's say China and Russia go rogue, take a few satellites out, and you don't have comms anymore. So, and your systems and your communication systems don't work. Yeah, okay, go back to paper and pen, right? Most people won't be able to do that, and they won't be able to run their business on it because we're reliant. So I definitely think driverless cars is a good example.
Chris,
driverless cars.
I got to ask you to wind up because we're running out of time, Chris. So
that's my example. We become used to driverless cars, and then the system gets crashed or taken off. We don't have any cars to drive. So
exactly.
That's the example.
I mean, final comment from you, Michael, if you wouldn't mind. And literally 15 seconds, if you wouldn't mind.
I think people have to understand that autonomy is different to automated. So once we get past the level 7 autonomy, now 11-point scale, humans can't intervene. So true AI gets to the point where it's setting the mission. When we talk about control, either before, during, or after the execution of outputs, once we get to a level 7 and above, humans can't intervene. So we can't control the AI.
Good point. Me. Listen, panel, thank you so much. So as Dennis Shepherd's just said, fascinating conversation. We need to keep it going. We'll definitely return to this. Just a quick reminder, if you do want to get hold of the copy of the report on which this is based, do go to the ASIS Foundation website. Just one other thing, there's a current research going on influencing the security budget. We would very much like your views. So please, if you wouldn't mind just sparing us 10 minutes to go to the website and fill in your views on influencing the security budget. What's the factors? It's another holy grail. It's seemingly not quite as important as the one we've heard about today. Just to remind everybody that we'll be going over again next, we're back to the normal time next Thursday, when the topic is security management Canada style, what's been happening in Canada and what can we learn. And we'll be launching the Canadian OSPAs next week. And the week after that, attracting teenagers to security work. How is the sector doing? That's supposed to be the holy grail. Goodness me, there's some interesting stuff going on there. Good and bad, we'll be telling you more. Once again, thank you very much indeed to my panel. Thank you very much indeed to the audience. I just say one final thing, which I say at the end of all of these webinars. Wherever you are in the world, stay safe.